Hello, everybody. As Shivani mentioned, my name is Kamuela Enos. Um, and full disclosure, they asked me to give a presentation. I super wasn't expecting this much people. Which is it's good to see you all. I will be sharing, as the title denotes, this idea of indigenous data visualization, but the presentation itself builds off of a presentation that I did last year in the space, which kind of provides the actual data visualization space will be a component of it. Will be at the tail end of providing context. I think what I hope to talk about is the work that we are doing in Indigenous data visualization here at the Academy for Creative Media and a creative space at West Oahu has a genealogy of practice, and we want to provide the broader context for its work. So the presentation I'm going to do is kind of focused on some theory around what is Indigenous innovation first, and the premise of our office, and then we'll go into some of the initiatives after we ground ourselves in the theory of that I've based the office that I have started under, and then dive into just what our current practices and projects we're working on that movement. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the presentation as soon as I share screen. Oh, of course, I have it on the wrong ones. Let me make sure I'm on the right slide. So we're working right up until had to jump on the Zoom. So it's been a crazy week. Okay. So what I think is important to start with is for the Office of Indigenous Knowledge and Innovation, we position innovation as the restoration. Our understanding of innovation is not based out of the lexicon that may be thrown around in places like Silicon Valley. It comes from the deep practice of movement building of my community of origin. So because I am Native Hawaiian and I was raised primarily by community practitioners that have a long history of trying to understand how do we restore our ancestral practices, not just as a means of like the restoration of our identity, but the context of the community I was raised in. My name is Kamuela Enos. I was born and raised in the community of Wai'anae, which is the island of Oahu. It's a predominantly Native Hawaiian community. And my parents, Eric Enos and Rochelle Nui, were both activists in their different right. My father occupied land in the back of Wai'anae Valley and brought water down to restore our traditional agrarian lo'ikalo. And my mom is Rochelle Nui Enos, was a public health worker at the Wai'anae Coast Comprehensive, who had done a lot of research, a lot of work on guiding how to do research in an Indigenous community. And me as the eldest kid really kind of had no other choice but to do the work that I do now. So I start my presentation with my genealogy. So first and foremost, this is a view of one of the places that raised me in the back of Wai'anae Valley. This is Ka'ala Farms, and these are lo'ikalo. These are patches that the ancestors millennia before were growing our complex carb that fed out into the ocean and fed the estuaries where our lean protein lived. And through this model, they were completely self-sufficient. Hawaiians were not only self-sufficient on islands, they're self-sufficient in their own watershed. And these are the types of technologies they developed that allowed them to feed really islands that could hold high population densities, but they did so without crashing their ecologic carrying capacity. So this is my first teacher. Second layer of teachers, that's my father, that's me as a little kid, and these are two uncles, Uncle Eddie Ka'anana and Uncle Walter Paulo from Miloli'i, that were with my father in his activism as he sought to translate what was considered a quaint like byproduct of ancient times to something that is meaningful and impactful to be deployed in a quote unquote underserved Native community. to restore our opelu fisheries or mackerel fisheries as a means of economic development. And me as the youngest, watching these elders interact with my father in all aspects of life and program design and like implementation, like deeply influenced who I am. And they're like my family, like some of my family mentors. And these are my professional mentors. Before I moved over to the university, I worked at Mānoa Organic Farms in Wai'anae, which is a community-run social enterprise in the community of Wai'anae that sends young adults to college by running the daily operations of organic farm. So on the left is Uncle William Isla Sr., who is the rancher who opened the space for us to return. Top is Kukui Mauna Kea, that she's the founder of Mao, along with her husband, Gary. And on the bottom is Kaui Sana and Derek Partner, two students that when I started work 14, 15 years ago, I recruited, and when I left, they kicked me out because they could take my job and they knew how to run the work, which is part of my practice. So I'm just going to jump in really quickly to the 4 points is fundamental to my office, the office that I run, and therefore the underpinning of Indigenous data visualization initiatives that we're working on. The first principle of our office we think about is restating our value. And this is an old presentation. I've actually had it from before I moved over to the university, and I would use it while I was working in community to talk about the innovation, the work and innovation we were doing then. And it rings as true now that I'm in university as when I was working at Ma'o Farms or on the board member of Purple Maya, for example. The first step of this process we're going through is to restate our value. I raised my daughter, she went to Hawaiian language school, and the things we'd find ourselves doing is we try to think about, as parents, we think in English and try to find the Hawaiian words for it. And what I thought was an opportunity was like, well, how do we do the opposite? Like, how do we think in Hawaiian and find the proper English words for what we're doing? And I found that when we would use the word Hawaiian culture, it was interesting because neither the word Hawaiian or the word culture are our words. And the word culture for me is important, but it's also something I've like the word freedom, where it's very emotionally powerful, but also poorly defined. And people will pay lip service to culture, but they'll cut the funding for it. That's the first thing you cut. So, being I grew up as one of 5 punk rockers in my high school, had that kind of energy. It was like, oh, they're not going to do that to us anymore. So the thinking was, well, if we could choose in words what our ancestors, we could choose the English words of what our ancestors did that I felt was more authentic. We came up with this idea, ancestral sciences and technologies of integrated biosystems management. And that was a really specific choice of words. I created this back when I was at the farm and doing community, like fundraising for a community organization. The reason why we chose it is because science represents pedagogy. Science represents like our ancestors just didn't wake up every day surprised to be alive. Like they had a very specific pedagogy and way of understanding the universe that was ordered and that was replicable. And technologies were the things that they designed from these sciences that allowed them to be self-sufficient in their watersheds. So like ahupua or lo'ikalo to me are technologies, is decentering, reclaiming the word technology from contemporary use case and positioning it through the lens of our ancestors. So you give some examples of that. For example, in pre-contact society, Native Hawaiian communities were non-monetary, had a non-monetary economy. So therefore, our ecology was our economy. We managed the landscape in a way that we didn't have a linear single point, like a GDP to guide our thinking. The basic premise was that we understood that the fitness of people and abundance of the landscape were the metrics of the state. And at the end of every year, there would be this ceremony called the Makahiki ceremony, where the chiefs would come to a valley, and the people of the valley would show how much food they could produce and how fit they were as people. And now that is kind of considered that was cute little cultural practice. Actually, it was a year-end reporting to your chief, where the two key metrics of fitness of people and productivity of landscape was assessed. And during those types of ceremonies, you could actually get your contract renewed for the next year. So these are these deep types of practices that our ancestors held that allow us to understand the relevance of their thinking to contemporary society. The second component of it, like at the macro, people managed our economy as our ecology as an economy. At the micro level, because Hawaiians tended to live in discrete watersheds called ahupua'a, like families lived within the watershed, and the idea that you never traded with other watersheds for basic commodities. Everything your families needed, they were able to be self-sufficient and provide themselves. And at that level, at the micro level, and the dailiness of work, like you couldn't separate who is your family unit from who is your employer, from who is your spiritual leader. Like they're all the same people. We didn't bifurcate work and employment and education in different spaces. They all happen in the same space. Moreover, we understood the land itself was a deified form of our ancestors. Our culture was what they called biocentric versus anthropocentric, meaning that we didn't see the landscape as our dominion to use. We didn't come from that spiritual tradition. In our spiritual traditions, we are the youngest siblings on an ancestral sentient landscape. And everything we did, we understood we're working on the body form, the deified body form of our ancestor. And therefore, that thinking underpinned how we set up our spaces of industry and education. We didn't extract beyond the carrying capacity. We always cared for. We had an intrinsic understanding of what was needed to live within an ecosystem. Contemporary Hawaiian society, we see that the poverty we see in our community is recent and learned, and it's structural. It didn't come from our community. It came from the severing of the symbiosis we used to have, where we could live in the relationship with landscape. And as a lot of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders removed from their practices and landscapes and repositioned in society, the loss of that symbiosis impacted us, and it impacted our landscape in equal measure. So the case we make, and was really important, that we cannot solve for the ecological issues we're seeing and the social issues we're seeing in silos. And the communities that I come from and we represent have always been making the case, the actual intervention is the restoration of these practices. We have a deep and profound blueprint that we are working from, that we have the responsibility to bring into contemporary times. The second component of the model is to reframe our work. Starting with a lot of my background, I have a bachelor's in Hawaiian Studies and a master's in urban and regional planning, and then a whole bunch of years working in community innovation startups. And we began to see a lot of language and really important thinking around decolonization is super important and awesome. But then we also began to understand the idea of we began to think about what does indigenization look like, and the way that we've always, me and my peers, frame the idea of indigenization is to repurpose systems and structures that were thrust upon you.
Okay, I found this on the web for purpose the systems and structures that were thrust upon you. Check it out.
Okay, well, anything else you want to tell me, you jerk? I've been having this problem with Siri quite a lot. She somehow thinks that I'm talking to her. That's hilarious. Oh, what's going on with my computer? Okay, so we give an example for me of like what an indigenized thing is. If you ever watch a video on like taro farming, for example, or like cultural practice, in the background, you always hear slack key guitar, and it just matches so well, right? You just hear that relaxing sound of a slack key guitar, and of course, yeah. Nothing about that guitar is Hawaiian. It wasn't made in Hawaii. It was not a traditional instrument, except the people of place used that instrument and embedded it to be such a deep carrier of their intention that it became a natural part of their daily lives. And the ancestors of Hawaii did a lot of that. You know, there was a lot of things they've indigenized. They took the printing press, and in the time of early monarchy, we had almost a 99% rate. There are all of these different models of us indigenizing contemporary things to bring into an ancestral use case. So we designed a framework for that in the spaces we work from. We call it the triple PICO analysis. The first part of that process we thought about, we use the term PICO in the organization I worked with at Mānoa Farms, and it's a principle that was taught by through our really beloved community leader, Uncle Kikuni Blaisdell. And in general sense, like, you know, there are many different ways it's defined, and many different people use the term. As a Hawaiian organization, we use the term in this way, and it is our way, but it doesn't preclude other people's usage of it. And I don't mean to be offensive if you come from a community practice that uses that term, but this is how we used it in our work to care for our youth and our land. The first PICO I understood as connection points. We had 3 PICO on our bodies. We had our fontanelle that connected us to our ancestors and our dream state, and we called Po, the primordial place. We had a second PICO, which is in our navel, and it connected us to all and those who are living with us, those that are alive now, the living. And then the third fontanelle, or the third PICO, was our reproductive organs that reconnected us to the future generations. And we saw these PICO as a transept. All decision making was holding the lineage you carry, understanding the contemporary work you're doing, and being clear on what are future generations coming and how are we planning for them. So in the indigenization process we deployed, we began to think about, like, in the process of indigenization, like, what are the ancestral things that we want to bring into a contemporary space? We thought a lot about, like, being really specific and not granular, not using general terms. And therefore, when we did the work, we think about, you cannot just incept an idea using a cultural practice. The key thing in most indigenous communities is you have to show your lineage and your genealogy. Like, not only what was the practice, like doing the literature review, and then like getting out and applying the practice, having calluses on your hands and understanding it as a living thing. But then the third part of that is, like, what aha moment do you have when you do an ancestral practice that provides you insight on what is its use in contemporary times? And always, 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 who are your teachers? You couldn't just take knowledge. Like, mapping the genealogy of thought that you carry was the first layer. The second is, how does then bringing these ancestral practices into contemporary use empower your community? How do indigenous communities use their ancestral systems in contemporary times to solve for providing them executive decision-making in their own homes, not performance of advisory boards, but they're using their practices to reclaim agency. And the third part of the analysis, after communities reclaim this agency, is in the process of reclaiming agency and making decisions on its own behalf. How are they ensuring that they're providing a platform, the last PICO, for future generations' right to abundance? The third part of this process is to then enter into contemporary practices. How do we use that indigenization framework and things like grants and business plans? And I have 2 examples from my time in a community organization, and we've been using this a lot in the university of doing that. When I was at Mānoa Farms, for example, the 2 metrics we tracked on a daily basis was sales of product and GPAs of student. And we felt that was super important because an indigenous community, like a Native Hawaiian community, the pressures on land and people is immense. We're always subject to environmental racism. Like, dumps are invariably where your indigenous communities are. Used to be that, like, dumps, like utilities, and now homes that they can't own are all over our indigenous communities. And also indigenous students, if you don't have a post-secondary education, you're subject to a lot of, like, underemployment or working in spaces where you're exploited for your labor. Not that a college degree doesn't provide that, but we also felt it was a really important attaining a degree gave them agency and decision-making power in their community, as well as opportunities for advancement economically. So we chose those two metrics because we understood them. They're contemporary metrics of power. But as I shared earlier, when we thought about the triple PICO analysis to what does it mean to have an organic farm, live in your community, we understood that our ancestors were the first organic farmers. And organic farming, therefore, was a means where the focus wasn't on annual yields, but the focus was care of soil. And using organic farming as the closest correlative to our ancestral practices, we adopted that in contemporary times. But then we thought about our ancestral metrics. As mentioned in pre-contact society, our ancestors would, at the end of every year, assess the viability of each valley by seeing how fit people were and how abundant the landscape was. So we took those ancestral metrics and we brought them into contemporary use cases. So therefore we call that the metrics of the makahiki, or that ceremony they did of assessment, and use that for a business model. The second example we thought we used from ancestral thinking and contemporary uses was when we were recruiting for students for the farm. And I think about it now when we recruit at the university, it's kind of the same thing. We look at what are all of the barriers to increasing Native Hawaiian and Pacific Island participation in higher education. And we got to see, like, you know, we were looking at students not knowing where to go. We saw fractures in like funders or policy around increasing numbers of students going to college, but not having the right practice to do it. We looked at a lot when we worked at the farm, colleges, and so labor, looking for good employees and trying to build new businesses. And all of these things we saw as silos. So we're able to enter into the space using what we called our awai, which was a traditional mode of carrying water from the top of a valley, from the po'owai, through all of our agrarian lo'i, our different spaces that grew food. And this waterway exited into the estuary to feed our nearshore reefs and pelagic fishes. And we called that our awai. And therefore we created our awai recruitment framework, where we, instead of water and the tracking of water, because water was the most precious thing to us, we asked, what is the most precious thing to us? Now it's our students. And who are all the people that are along a matriculated pathway of students to enter into a university? What does that pathway look like? Who are all the people, and how we convene them all together to develop a plan of matriculation? So while they're holding the students, we understand what they need and they're being supported. But as the students pass through, you know, what is this articulated path that'll get a student from high school to employment in their own community or adjacent? And this model was really important for us because it decentered any single organization as being the most important, and it recentered all of us along a commitment to care for our students, the most valuable thing we have, and to work together. But being part of it, there's a lot of benefits to it. You could, when we develop this model, I go to high school and say, hey, I know how much students you have to graduate. I can help you graduate them and get them into college. And when I went to the college using this model, I know your recruitment numbers. We can help you do more than having a student come and take their scholarship and split. Like, we can guarantee you that we can recruit them, but then we can retain and matriculate them. And the really powerful thing, anyone that's like, and we could tell funders, we can give you a tranched investment that can track a student from 10th grade to employment. And everyone participating had access to longitudinal data and how this young adult they're working with, where they are in the world. So this was the ancestral value and system that we brought into a contemporary use case as an example. And the final part of our model, which I think is really critical, is reestablishing our agency. Like, talk is super cheap. If you don't have metrics, you don't have ability, you can't show efficacy and rigor. So that was something we focused on. I want to show some of the things that came from deploying this model. This is an example in a circular model. This is probably like almost like 8 years old. That's how long I've been out. But using this process, we're able to get 108 associate degrees, 23 bachelor's degrees, and 3 master's degrees from a community organization. You know, with young adults in an underserved Indigenous community, the community intervention was showing a statistical difference versus students that just would go to college alone. And we're showing this deep impact of our practices and our ancestral thinking. Another example, while we were there, we partnered with University of Hawaiʻi in the Mauliola study. And actually this study is the basis of me feeling confident to move to the university. And I think it's really important. We had a biomedical researcher who's actually from our community, studied the gut microbiome of the students and found that young adults on the farm are 50 to 60% less likely to develop type 2 diabetes and save the state $15,000 a year or more per student. And why I'll stay on this for a second, because this is where you begin to see data being collected. And you begin to see like the robust amount of community organizations by restoring their practices are beginning to be understood as innovative. So when we talk about data visualization, we're not just visualizing to visualize. Like the intention of the things we'll be speaking to later is how do we capture these types of data points being rooted in communities of practice to show the efficacy of what we're doing. And why this was also important, the Mauliola study to me was, even though I went to college, I have my master's in urban planning, and I was a adjunct faculty at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. I would teach classes in community-based planning. I always had a healthy suspicion of research with Hawaiian communities because the business model tended to be, how do we study Indigenous people to tell them that they're sick? And then publish and do it over and over again and high-five each other and not really have anything to show for it. Or like, here's an intervention coming from a community we're going to bring to you from the university to come to a community and try to get you to get well because you need help. This was the first time we saw the university use the power of research to affirm a community intervention that positioned the community as important as the researcher. And it helped us move things that we felt were anecdotal. We could sense it to being peer-reviewed. And when we got this data, if any of you have ever worked in a nonprofit, you can see we were in gangbusters. We used it for fundraising. We used it for policy work. But the most important thing we used this data on was with their own students. So they began to understand how their gut microbiome worked. They began to understand the value of what they were doing growing food and going to college, not just to them, but to their communities. And I think this is like, wanted to ground this presentation in this part right here, because it's a prelude to what's to come. And there are other things that we did using models, like Purple Maya Foundation, for example, which I was on the board of as Indigenous tech startup, began to pair researchers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers together to begin to design for interventions for community organizations. We were able to, at the organization I worked with, create college degrees. We were able to leverage our work to ask for standing up a Bachelor's of Applied Science at West Oahu and bring faculty over. So all of these multipliers that came from community organizations, be able to create Indigenous organizations, using our practices as innovation and to then create contemporary outcomes. I have a quick example too of some of the data we're accruing. There is a taro farm, Aloi Kalo, in the middle of Pearwood Shopping Center that we ran students through to ask the question, what is a taro farm in the middle of an urban, what kind of benefits does a taro farm in an urban community provide? What kind of, we call it billable services they can start charging people for. We ran college students. There's Anthony DeLuz, who was the kahu of the farm, for 3 semesters through working with him to begin to identify with his consent what is the value of his work to society in ways that we can start organizing around. And the basic thing that came out of this was a graphic created by 2 graduate students. Nigel Rosette was one of them, where they looked at what are the inputs, what are the medium in which they're working, which is the farm. And they began to look at this is graduate students, they're very preliminary, but these were all of the discrete types of things that the farm is producing beyond just taro that could really be mobilized around. And these organizations who almost always work on shoestring budgets, always at the verge of like having to shut their doors because they have to figure out programmatic funding every year to fickle funders. What are the hard data points to show you're providing this and these are services that are needed? This is another example of the type of ways we could, the data that we're beginning to accrue that was important for us to think about visualizing. So quickly with that, I was asked to move over to the Office of Research under directly by President Vasilis Ramos, going on 5 years ago to create the Office of Indigenous Knowledge Innovation. I sit within the Office of Research in our own department, directly under Vasilis. Our general function, as when we started, we wrote this Judas graphic on the back of a napkin 5 years ago, and it's still holding true. We felt that there were three groups that were intersecting. There was one circle was our communities of practice that are either conserving ancestral practices and or ecosystems, caring for conservation of practice in place. There was a group of researchers and people working in education and the university that are interacting with these communities of practice. And then there's also government and social entrepreneurs that are intersecting in this practice. And I felt that OII, YKI could be in the middle to hold that space. That, you know, in the Venn diagram, like true intersect of education and community practice, there's anna-based education, intersect of community practice and in government and innovation, there's like social entrepreneurialism coming aboard, and there's accelerators in the middle. Those are all really important people that organizations or movements that we wanted to kind of find a middle ground for. But the outputs for us are really important because outputs are very societal. They weren't just limited to the Hawaiian communities. We're focusing on how do we create 21st century citizens? How do we create 21st century places of employment? And how do we show that ancestral practices can be the seat of our resilience plans and our economic, ecologic, and social through this work? They used to heal fractured implements in pre-contact society. I never talk about practices I haven't done before. So I had to make a pevo when I was younger at a taro farm. My lo'i kalo, papakuea, the board that we used to make kalo. My dad asked me to make one and I wasn't listening. I cracked it. He came over and I said, I think we have to fix it. And the process he walked me through, I felt was important to this because the process was, how do you heal a fractured space in spaces that are broken? The first thing I learned from him, so we have equity, reciprocity, and transparency. The first part of fixing a fracture wasn't rushing to fix it. It was asking the question, who broke it? And why did it break? It was a really important question, like, was the wood rotten? Is it no good? Or did you not pay attention to what you're doing and did you break it? Which was the latter. The second part, but that to me then translate in this work of indigeneity is like, we cannot just rush to fix things in the communities that are broken. We have to understand the historical context. We have to own it. And we have to be clear on, you know, this is what happened. And we also have to understand the function. Like, what were pre-contact practices doing? Like, what are you trying to fix? So that willingness to understand historical context and historical loss is important. The second part of the thing that I love about PEVAs is they hold both sides tight. And to me, that's reciprocity. And that's the willingness to build interventions that heal fractures. And those are the reciprocity piece, to me, in the work that we've done. They live in, when are you inviting people to a process? And they live in your line item budgets of how much people are being compensated. And part of that work is like identifying who are the community organizations in this restoration work that have been holding it down. They've been doing the work before any money was there. Now people are rushing to be interested in them. How are we working with them to support them in their work? But then how are we as university and government understanding what they need to be successful, but also what we need to be successful? Like, how do we set ourselves up to be in right alignment and find a beneficial way of working together? Because if you do things because you did something bad to someone and that's it, you're not going to do it forever. But if you do something because you understand what they're doing is intrinsic to your well-being, you're going to make the commitment to have a permanent partnership. And pebbles are meant to be permanent. And the last part I think is important is transparency. It's like the wabi-sabi, like we don't hide the fact that things were fractured. The fractures show that if you put a pebble on something, it was meant to be passed down along generations. You know, this is sacred and this is special and this is beloved. So we want to make sure that people saw that this broke in the past, it's probably going to break again. We fixed it. This is how we did it. We want you to fix it. I'm going to just not go on this part because I think I provided a long enough time giving an overview, but these are some of the things that we feel are critical of, like what we had before, what was the systems by which we lost things, and how are we going to get it back with communities as experts and researchers as ally. But I want to get into the working premise of the data science hub. So the working premise is that ancestral practices or biocentric sciences and technologies that have thousands of years of R&D and ancestral sciences are optimized for how do humans live within the carrying capacity of their landscape, because they were done by island people. We didn't have continental types of expanses. We had to live within a really finite biosystem, and that served as a force function to develop sciences that are hyper aware of our carrying capacity and our footprint. The second premise is that indigenous communities are ecosystems. Contemporary implementation is founded on the idea that indigenous communities are ecosystems of innovation that require long-term investment for the restoration of the work. And the working practice we're looking at is how do we co-produce, like the Mauliola study she lifted up for me, research that is beneficial for the university. It provides novel research and funding opportunities, which is so important to our one university, but is done in co-production with the community, with their consent and alongside them to show the efficacy of their work. Because what we're finding now, if our community organizations fail, we lose everything. They're the ones that are holders of this deep, powerful knowledge. We need their organizations to be viable and vibrant. And our office functions, how will we know? And I say this in public all the time because this is our accountability, that the community level investment is being driven into community organizations. At the university level, research is co-designed with community to not only affirm that their ancestral practices were sciences, but moreover, an individual community organization can deploy these sciences to solve persistent societal issues in their own time, not just for their community, but for others. I don't want to say armed, but armed with this data, it provides a shift in the mental model if you subscribe to design thinking to reposition indigenous communities as places of innovation and places of practice that are tender and delicate and they need support, of course, but have a practice of resilience that I think contemporary society has yet to reach. And we need them to be at the table to guide us there. So I'm going to close with the data, indigenous data science. So basically, indigenous data visualization practice. I'm sitting right now in the Academy of Creative Media, UH Oahu. If you can look around, there's a bunch of really cool data we're projecting on the wall. I'm currently in the middle of Wai'anae Valley, right, Kari? In Kauai, geo-rendered into a space. The general idea of Indigenous Data Science Hub is that we have a data visualization center within the middle of the Academy of Creative Media at UH West Oahu, which can either do data visualization on walls, or we can do a 3D printout of an ahupua'a or island and project data visualization layers. These hubs are meant to intersect with community organizations and students and faculty to be a space where students can work with regional communities of practice on ground, like doing ancestral practices, and then come into this lab and turn that practice into data visualization layers to teach the students the value, to teach the emerging practice of rendering what they're being taught in a contemporary space, in contemporary ways. So as you can see, there's 4 pillars of practice, protocol, and knowledge stewardship, student training and professional development, data management, and science communication. So our current work in this space on my end is being underwritten by an NSF F-score grant, as well as NOAA earmark that we'll go into more. The genealogy of our Indigenous data visualization centers that we're working in was when I started working in the Office of Research. Stood up the Office of Indigenous Knowledge Innovation. There was a partnership with Polynesian Voyaging Society, where they were trying to create what they call the third va'a. It was asking the question like, how do you teach about being on the canoe when you're not in the ocean? So they're partnering with Lava Labs and Dr. Jason Lee and Kari Noi, a PhD student who is now in my office as well, to create technologies or representation of the star compasses, as well as put 360 cameras on the canoes as they sailed, to provide visual tools for curriculum. And it was initially by working with Kari on that project, I began to be really excited about like, wow, this has such incredible use case for us. And the second part of the genealogy of these Indigenous data science hubs is that we had set up an MOU with Leeward Community College, which serves the largest concentration of Native Hawaiian students, I think, in the world, because it captures central and west Oahu. And in sitting with the chancellor and the director of the Native Hawaiian Student Services, Chancellor Penalosa, and Director Momi Kamahele, Chancellor Penalosa was like, how can we set up Leeward Community College to be a starting point of a STEM career for students that are in our service area who tend to be Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander? And if they're going to be going to community colleges, they're probably going to have a lot of remedial needs in those spaces, just what data has been showing. But then Kumu Momi asked, how do more Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students see themselves in STEM? How they see this, like their ancestry or their self reflected in this space. So those were the starting questions we worked with. The working model of the hubs. And if it looks like I created this part of the presentation today, you're probably guessed right, because we're like banging out our work all day. But what is really important for the opportunity, and I'm going to show some of the projects we're working on. By creating the hubs and partnering with communities, it allows the community organization to be partnering with us, because students have to be doing work on land to then come here. By partnering with us, they kind of become a classroom. They kind of become faculty and facility, and allows our organization to give them direct operational support. If you've ever worked again in a community organization, they often struggle, and the bulk of their funding comes from programmatic funding. Our goal is that we want to call them, you're the classroom and you're the teacher. You're going to be housing our student. So let's help underwrite your operational support for this year. And we piloted it with the community organization we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. But it became a sustained funding resource for them so they could build the practice. The other part of the circle, and I forgot to title them. So the far left circle is impact on community. The far right circle, what I should have bordered there, is impact on research. The second thing it provides is a space for ancestral and contemporary practices to be woven together in a safer way. When the students work with the community practitioners, the important part of it is they set what the research topic is. They let us know what is to be shared and what is not to be shared. And they train the students in how to gather the right things. But it's also embedding the students from the beginning and like, what is the function of research? Like when the students we work with are researching the communities that they're raised in. So what does it mean for you to be researching we call it aina momona, like the abundance of land and the land that you're living in. And quite often in the spaces you're working when it's covered in concrete or all these other things, how can they be allowed to learn about the restoration of practices in their communities and render that learning into like data layers or data visualization or data points? And I think the part that's the most important to me is that in the middle, like the byproduct of this is student empowerment. These hubs are now becoming spaces of multidisciplinary research with the students, that the question the students are asking are being compiled in these hubs. We'll give an example of this. Last year, we had an earmark from Senator Schatz's office to work with the community organization, Malama Pu'uloa. The earmark itself was designed to figure out how can we do biocultural restoration, and because Malama Pu'uloa is working on the estuaries in Pearl Harbor. What are cultural interventions into restoring highly impacted estuaries and places and cultural sites like you would have to do in Pearl Harbor? So we used this earmark to fund the community organization is biocultural restoration work of removing mangroves and clearing out spaces. But the second part of the proposal is how do we concurrently do this to build citizenry? Like how do we build the community buy-in to the restoration of places that have been so egregiously degraded? So the internship also paid for a bunch of college students, first-year college students, to work with us over the summer, to work closely with the community organization, and began to develop and do a presentation on what they've learned in the space. What was exciting about what came out of it was the community organization was able to receive a substantial amount of money to continue to do the work and take the pressures off the director in fundraising for that window of time. But concurrently, the students were able to, and all of them were from EVA, they're certainly like was focused at Leeward Community College, to be reacquainted with their landscape and develop research questions and bring to the CreateX space what they learned on land and rendered into some really exciting presentations that, you know, part of what we can do is can do a 3D printout of your moku, and they're doing visualization layers on these 3D printouts of EVA to show these are the things I'm learning and this is what I'm growing. It was a really important partnership because the general premise of this is how do we create students that understand their self-actualization tied to the health and well-being of the lands that are raising them, and we're embedding it early on. The second thing we're working on is the Indigenous Data Hub Fellowship, and Indigenous Data Hub build out at Leeward Community College. So another project we have is taking what's happening here at CreateX with the goal of then moving over to Leeward Community. Our goal for a project is to take what's happening in the CreateX space and build them out across the state and regional community colleges with the focus, communities that have a higher concentration of underserved youth that still have access to practice and landscape. How do we situate these hubs in those communities to provide those resources to students, faculty, and practitioners? So with that, we have a project at Leeward Community College where it's a year-long planning process. We started with the faculty and with the admin, got their buy-in to the idea, identified a space, bringing resources to build it out there. We then met with faculty. We brought them to the CreateX space to see if any of them had like how this could be woven into their curriculum. And we have 3 faculty projects that we are working on, developing curriculum for as a pilot. And then we also put a fellows program out, which is the most important part, where we have 5 students, first-year college students, working with soon to be Dr. Karinoi, and myself, PhD student Karinoi, who runs the Creative Space, and myself, in a almost like a 9-month long fellows program, where they're helping to co-design the curriculum, but more importantly, like doing this as a means of self-actualization, because we hired 3 mentors to work with them. One is Kuha Ozain, who's a well-respected indigenous designer in Kumuhula. My younger brother, Solomon Enos, is a well-respected artist. And then we have a community practitioner, Dr. Mikiala Lidstone, who runs the Uluwa'e Learning Center, are with the students in helping them with the design. So as you can see, like we have the goals of the center, and our project is part of the EPSCoR. So a state EPSCoR, we have seed funding arms. So we're building out Leeward Community College, and we're in the process right now after developing this year-long practice to call it a practice, and then potentially look at another community college to do a build out the next year. And we're still finalizing that. So I will stop there. That was a fire hose, but I think I close with this picture. My younger brother, Solomon, is an artist, and he has this picture of like our ancestors there was no word for environment in Hawaiian. The idea that you could be outside of the environment was ridiculous because they were such deeply involved in their environment. We were our environment. And this indigenous data visualization idea is really new. It's really tender, it's really fragile, but I think we're doing our very best to establish it as a practice, not just as a curriculum, like as something that is meaningful for our partners. But again, that how we will know we'll be successful will not be in student numbers or projects set up. I mean, those are all important things that we're shooting, but if we can go into the landscape and we can see the next generation tied again to their landscaping practice, and using these spaces, they can afford to live here and they can bring their practices back in contemporary times. So I will end my presentation there. Thank you. Doing a presentation on Friday is nuts. I sound like I'm running out of gas, but it's been a full week, and I want to see if there's any. I think there's questions. What's my cue now, Shivani?
Thank you so much, Kamu. We can open it up to questions now. You can either post it in the chat if you're joining remotely, or ask a question. You just need to be under one of these microphones.
Hi, Kamu. Thank you for that. I thought that was incredible. My name is Noah. I'm a staff member here at Mānoa. I was really impressed with the logic models that you were sharing that showed research-based social outcomes. And there was actually a forum held last Friday by the Office of Vice Provost for Research and Scholarship here about community engagement. And one of the questions that I had for them was, the UH strategic plan. It talks about how under research excellence, they want to see all of this progress made in climate science, ocean, earth, and atmospheric science, data science, food security. And the metric that they're using for determining success in that way is actually grant funding in those areas, right? And I understand, especially like within the context of EPSCoR, this idea of grant funding as a measure of research competitiveness and of research capacity. But I was curious, looking at those logic models that you had that showed like actual social outcomes as a product of research activity, to what extent has your office had conversations with university leadership about those metrics becoming a potential metric related to that for the strategic plan, right? In measuring social impact in those areas?
Holy, I'm really lucky that President Ramos has been really supportive of our work, and I think part of what I think the opportunity is when we, and I don't know, it's a super good question, but part of the opportunity that we're thinking about is when you pair community co-production of research, the grants are not just going to the university. When we see our communities as an ecosystem of innovation, we're really starting to think about co-producing research with the community, with community of equity, and not just the equity that the E and the DEI kind of equity, but like equity as ownership. Like you're creating research that's viable to them, community organizations using that research for like keeping their organization solvent. And I think that, and that's a really good question. I think part of the challenges of the business model, it's the current business model, it's been practiced for a long time. But I hope that the work that we're doing in our office can begin to show pathways of diversifying that, or valuing and indigeneity as a viable means of economic resilience and ecologic resilience too. So I'm super down, and maybe it's like my brain is on 345, 545 kind of energy, but I think that's a really good question. I think we're in the process of trying to figure that out in the Office of Research.
I had a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Which is, can I work for you? That's a joke. You don't have to answer. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't take
You don't have to
though. And also, I have Dr. I have Kari Noy, but it's really important that this work is done with Kari Noy, and she designed the space, and I wanted to make sure that she's present for this too, because she's another indigenous, she is an indigenous computational scientist, and she's the builder of the space working. So she's sitting next to me. Was there another question?
I think there's one question in the chat.
What role does indigenous led evaluation and data sovereignty have in this work? You want to get that part?
Yeah, but there's a second part. Can
Oh.
you share any experiences with this and
Yeah.
how it's helped your collective communities?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think right now, for the Indigenous Data Hub Fellowship that Kamuela shared, we're in our first pilot of that. And from that, we've been developing a practice of trying to figure out how the proper way is to make individual data agreements with each of our collaborators, because it's super important that when we engage with community members and also faculty, we have a process that's called kapu and kanawai, but essentially what it is it's a practice of establishing what can be shared and what cannot be shared, and in which ways can it, if it can be shared, in the sense of it can only be shared through certain certain, can't remember the word, certain times. This is also me in the afternoon. But I think through this experience, I think what is through the experience of from these fellowships, I think it's been very helpful because it helps to get over the kind of what we've been trying to work against is that even though we're indigenous, we know that how universities can be very, very harmful to communities, and we still are university members going out into community and trying to do research projects. So through this experience, I think we've learned how to make sure and also frame when our engagement and practice to make sure that anything that's happening with these projects, first and foremost, is the benefit of students and community. Community in the sense that anything that all the research and anything that we create sits and is owned by community, because they're the source of basically the IP that we are visualizing. We're kind of tool makers only in that sense. The actual knowledge and innovation does, and I'm saying this from a computer science perspective, live with the community members who have done the work to gather this data. And then also for students, this experience, I think, helps them also realize and learn proper etiquette for research. So yeah, I could keep going, but I know there's other questions, but thank you for that question.
And then really, like, part of what we do is we pre-scope the community organization first. And we work with, there's a long process of building relationship with them. And they only, like, we have the agreement that they only share what they think they want to be shared. But it isn't, we're not just collecting data to collect data. The data is collected in the process of doing a practice. Like what is needed for stream flow in Alo'i, what is needed for like the types of data needed for them to understand the larval cycles of some of the fisheries. That were like, those are the types of questions that are being asked, and I think we, and
They're,
all,
they're entrusting
Yeah.
their data with us and with we will respond with creating something that'll
Yeah.
be useful for and safe for them to use and that they can own.
and also the final thing is that we kind of are learning as we're going. So I'm not holding that we understand completely what we're doing,
Yeah.
but we always move with the speed of trust and that, we work with it. We don't create one-offs with community organizations. Like if they're working with us, we're assuming that we're going to be working, like these hubs will be with them forever. Like these are not things that we're planning to build and leave. Like they're going to be a living practice that hopefully will outlive Kari and myself. And I saw some questions too. So I don't know about colonial visualization. I think it's just regular visualization that you
Western
could,
and
West, you
business.
could just take data and plop it on a chart and show it to people. I think indigenous data
But
visualization.
I mean, mapping also does have histories of colonial in the sense that by mapping things and erasing like traditional Hawaiian names and
Right.
things like that in it and or erasing historic sites and saying, no,
Right.
this is nothing, what was that kind of like the terra nullius kind of thing?
Yeah,
of what-
terra nullius, there's
what
nothing here.
they're like, oh, there's nothing here, but actually in an indigenous lens, there's everything is here. You can talk about that, but yeah.
And I think for Debbie, like how this incorporates Hawaiian, like beyond quantitative and knowing and learning, that is so important. And we're trying to hold the space to figure that out. The practitioners we work with, we're hoping to work with and we're in conversation. For example, we have Kuha'o Zane and Edith Kanakaole Foundation folks come out, and look at like what does this, especially we Kuha'o Zane, who's Nani Kanakaole's son and he's Halau Kekuhi. Like he's a dear peer of ours, and we've spent time with them. And they think a lot about like what does this mean to the concept of makavalu or the ways of ancestral observation methodologies. And we're trying to really hold that space open and learn as we go. And we want to ideally be spaces for both, but centered in indigenous ways of knowing first, and then discerning what are the quantitative things we want to, once we've established that practice, what are the quantitative types of metrics that matter to us versus focusing on the Western models first and then trying to give it a Hawaiian name after. But a lot of this is like in process and we're trying to figure out. And part of doing this presentation is an accountability. And we want to know people that we're working on these things and that we plan to continue to work as we build out hubs with other community organizations first. And we meet with the communities first, in the practice we've developed so far, before we really talk to institutions. Present UH Mānoa geography folks. Yeah, we have two graduate students that ran the Pu'uloa project with us. One was one graduate students in Enram, Oli. What is Oli's last name? Oh my God.
Cabri. I don't know how to
She just
pronounce
did a
it.
presentation on this actually in Enram's graduate student presentation yesterday. And there's Jade Rhodes, who's in the Department of the architecture department, but she's doing environmental architecture. We're super open and we would love to continue to figure out what collaboration looks like. This is really new and we really want to be inclusive. But the thing we are solving for first and foremost is student safety and community organization safety. And we want to move in ways that make sense for those groups first. Did we get all the questions?
No, that was only answer.
Sorry, Andre had one question. Could you provide some examples
Oh,
of
the
those
research.
research questions? Yeah.
We ran this through once. So I think, when we did our Pu'uloa fellowship, it was really awesome because the group we had, like it was 5 students, they're all from this area. One of them was from high school, moving into college, and one was in finishing up his baccalaureate and moving on to his master's. And the range of questions that came up in working with Malama Pu'uloa were very indicative of the students in their journey. The high school student actually had never been outside before. And
Oh, that's what you like to say.
he told us that earlier, but his mapping turned out like he went from like not being outside to being able to map locations of native and native flora and fauna along the Ewa corridor and his relationship with them now, and you really see like this deepened interest of that. On the other end of it, luckily we felt really honored. We were asked by Dr. Claire Nuhiva to give a presentation on our work and this 3-day summit she's doing on indigenous with Conservation International with indigenous conservation methodologies. And we presented on the findings of our student who participated. His name is Bryson Tugare. And Bryson actually was finishing up, he's from the community, really incredible student, finishing up his Bachelor's of Applied Science in Sustainable Community Food Systems at University of Hawaiʻi West Oahu. And his research project, his focus is on uala, which is native Hawaiian variant of sweet potato, on the restoration of uala along the Ewa corridor as a means to provide access to healthy food to the persistently houseless. And it was like,
Also, he was looking and he was analyzing where there's what is it, food insecurity.
Food insecurity
and
and
SNAP
incidents,
recipient.
SNAP recipients. So the broad range of just our first, of our stated goal, we got a community nonprofit sustain operational support, and we provided a cadre of students from the community a space for them to deepen their relationship with the lands that they currently didn't really have, just because the way things are situated here in Ewa. Like they left that with a deeper understanding. And a bunch of those students are signing up again for this summer. So we're seeing like they're wanting to return and deepen their practice. But those are 2 examples of research questions. I think when we get deeper with our community organizations and we started to have some preliminary conversation with some organizations in the community, they're looking at the table and beginning to generate research questions. And these tend to be around like water resources, some of the things that are impacting their ability to do the work.
How to restore traditional ways of farming.
Traditional farming. So it's like his use case is really interesting for students and for community partner. And then the faculty that we worked with at Leeward, like one of them wants to use the table to teach navigation. The second is using the table to teach mo'olelo
or Hawaiian mythology.
And then we had a third that is still in process, but they may or may not be able to work on it with us, just some timing, but they have like larval data.
Fish populations
yeah.
and estuaries in Kaneohe and Pu'uloa.
So 50 years worth of data that they're teaching out of Leeward.
It was data from 50 years ago, and
got
then they're taking contemporary data and they're comparing it.
Thank you, Kari. But those are all like, we're calling everything a pilot. We're learning, and like as like Kari and I are native Hawaiians, we have the right to carry our traditions into contemporary times, but we have, more importantly, the responsibility that we're doing it in a way that we're accountable, and that we are centering it on, for me, like the youth that live in this area have relationship with land again, and the community organizations that are carrying on these practices are receiving the resources they need to be successful, and that therefore the university has provided such a vibrant space of learning, but provided like a vibrant function in really supporting community practice. And this to me is research. We're like, and that this is being fully supported by Vice President Phyllis Ramos and the EPSCoR team. And who's really important and is on the call is Jason Lee and the Lava Lab and Chris Lee, Academy of Creative Media. have been sharing risk with us and being willing for us to take this out. And finally, this is being funded with National Science Foundation money, and the National Science Foundation is paying attention to this approach of how we can deepen, like, what does inclusion of Indigenous communities look like that isn't performative, but that it's really based on a restoration of practice as science. Ooh. Does that
Very
help?
much, yeah, and thank you very much, Kari. I think those were all the questions that we had. Thank you for your time and for sharing your knowledge. Really appreciate it.
I'll go fix up the PowerPoint. We were slammed all day. They were trying to work on it too. And then we'll share with everybody with the proper adjustments and maybe some better visuals. But thank you everyone for listening. And again, this is holding ourselves accountable and capable, like we're sharing this openly to know what we're doing. And if you have questions or deeper conversations, please don't hesitate to email me. I may not get back to you right away, but I won't be ignoring. I will be trying my best to get back to anyone who may say anything. So mahalo nui kako. Thank you.
Thank you.